Welcome to This Bit's Brilliant. I'm Simon Q. Elliott.
And I'm Paul Ging.
This time we're going to talk about one of the great rivalries in British and world sport.
And a monumental year for pop in the 1980s.
I'm going to talk about the perfect distance, which is about Coe versus Ovett in the late 70s and early 80s. And mostly it's about the 80 and 84 Olympics. What do you got?
1984, the year pop went queer, according to Ian Wade. Very interesting book. Can't wait to read you some of the brilliant lines from that.
Okay, so this time around I'm going to go first, and I'm going to talk about, like I say, Coe and Ovett. And I kind of think it's difficult for people to realise just how much they dominated the narrative in the late 70s and early 80s, not just in Britain, but actually globally. They were the two best runners in Britain, the two best runners in the world at 800 and 1500 metres. But they'd come up through very different ways. And Pat Butcher's book, The Perfect Distance, kind of talks about how different they were. And quite a lot of what he says is about you were either a Coe person or an Ovett person. Now, I was firmly an Ovett person. Mostly, I think, because I had a chip on my shoulder and Coe was called Sebastian. And that's entirely unfair and unreasoning, and he's a very accomplished man and was obviously a brilliant athlete. But
you probably knew a lot of Steves. I knew a lot of Steves as well, yeah. All right, Steve.
I knew a lot of Steves. But Ovett was portrayed as this working class kid who was just brilliantly talented. I mean, you know, like any person who wins an Olympic medal, he worked very hard. But his nickname was actually Nature Boy because he was such a natural runner, and there's brilliant stills. If you ever Google him, there's brilliant stills of him like running on beaches and things, and he looks beautiful, you know, just caught in those perfect moments. So yeah, Ovett was portrayed as the working class hero, and Coe, who did have kind of slightly, how can I say, posher links in his family, but was, you know, middle class. His dad's his relationship with his dad's really interesting, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
I think for Ovett they're only a year apart in age, but Ovett was sort of physically more mature. I'm fairly certain he'd have been the bloke that would have scared the crap out of everyone else in the changing rooms at PE when everyone was 12 or 13 and went, oh, well, he's grown up a bit quicker than the rest of us. But quite often in sport, those guys will, you know, dominate age groups. And I coach kids rugby where you get these guys who mature and they're massive compared to their sort of like all their teammates, and then suddenly everyone catches them up and they become ordinary.
Yeah.
And that never happened to Ovett. He maybe had to work a touch harder. They were both coming up through the 70s. Ovett was the sort of more mature and dominated. You know, he dominated his age group right up to like when he started to run in the senior races. But this is the early 70s. Here, what's really interesting and tells you a lot about how sort of the patrician rubbish that went around at that time. Ovett went to the European Junior Championships and won them. And when he got back to his school, he was given his half colours as though it wasn't that much of an achievement. And the three kids who won the county cross country got their full colours.
What?
Yeah, I know. For those who don't know, at university or at school, getting your colours was a big deal. So people talk about Cambridge or Oxford blue. That's getting your colours.
That's incredible, though, that you would, for an achievement like that, you get your half colours, and these people who've run at a local level are getting. It's very controlling. It's very dismissive, isn't it?
I think it tells you a lot you need to know. And there's an even better one. So anyway, look, they've got this rivalry. They're coming up. You know, they only ran before. I think it was before the late 70s. They only actually ran against each other once, and they didn't know. And it was in about 1972 or 73, and they ran in a cross-country race. And Ovett did really well, and Coe was way off the pace because he was still maturing physically. Now, there's pictures of him. He was, at the time, he was a very small, sort of slight figure. Yeah, for his age. Whereas, you know, Ovett's got this slightly sort of barrel chest and is this sort of, you know, just more mature bloke. The interesting thing about the two of them is that they both had quite interesting family dynamics. There's a lot of talk through Pat Butcher's book about how Ovett was working class and his mum was a sort of quite a tough market trader woman, and there's an air of snobbery about it.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't quite go that far, and it might be a bit harsh on him to say that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a slight air of, oh, she was a market trading woman, quite abrupt, quite this. But Ovett talks about it when he's interviewed for the book and sort of says, because they didn't have the privilege of education, they were slightly out of their depth. And Ovett had problems with people later, mostly with the press, who didn't like him because he didn't put up with their rubbish.
Yeah.
So, there's an air in the book of like this class thing.
I just remember at the time of being seen as a big class dynamic that, Ovett was portrayed in one way as a sort of working class hero. And Seb Coe, probably very unfairly, almost the suggestion he'd had it handed to him on a silver plate, because he was incredibly gifted and he must have worked incredibly hard to do what he did. And okay, perhaps he had a confidence and an ease that made him walk in those worlds beyond that in the things that he's done since as an MP and on an Olympic committee. But that's not really his fault. But that was always the narrative of the time, I think.
There's a touch of that narrative still being there in the book.
Yeah.
Pat Butcher, the writer, was there. So
yeah. Not to be confused with the EastEnders matriarch.
No.
Pat Butcher.
It does keep occurring to you, doesn't it?
I can't get it out of my head.
This episode is sponsored by And the Sun Shines Now by Adrian Tempany. The author of The Damned United, David Peace, called it the most important book about modern football I've ever read. Frank Cottrell Boyce called it brilliantly written, bold, important, honest and gripping, an examination of the state of football. Search for And the Sun Shines Now by Adrian Tempany. This episode is sponsored by King's Gold, the heart-stopping thriller from Simon Q. Elliott. Two of Captain Tom North's soldiers try to kill him. Journalist Henry North is shoved in front of a speeding van. The brothers need to find out who's trying to kill them and why before the murderers succeed. 800 years ago, England's crown jewels were stolen. There's still a price to pay. King's Gold by Simon Q. Elliott. Search for it on Amazon.
Coe, developed much later. He had asthma, he had eczema.
Whoa.
He wasn't that confident guy that sort of just trod easily into the world. I think his path was slightly harder. They're training away. Ovett is quite a good self-starter. He kind of knows what he wants. He goes through a couple of coaches who are really important to him, and he talks about how important they are to him. Coe was coached by his father, and his father's an interesting character. He'd been a POW.
Yeah.
He's been through the mill properly. But a lot of people who are interviewed for the book talk about how right-wing his politics are. And he wasn't shy about sharing that. He was also a very driven man, and Coe's clearly picked that up, and he became a very good coach by teaching himself. But the relationship was weird because he used to call Coe my athlete or the athlete, and not my boy or my son or Sebastian or whatever. And Coe used to call him Peter.
Okay.
And a lot of the people who were around at that time sort of decided, that is weird.
So as fathers and sons go, they weren't the hugging sort of kind, I take it.
And I, for one, support them in that. If you've been through a war with someone, you can give them a firm handshake and a pat on the shoulder.
Come on, we're a nation of huggers these days, Si. Next time I see you, I'm going to give you a big hug and a kiss on the forehead. How's that?
Touch me and die. Anyway, so Ovett's a good young runner, and he makes it to the Montreal Olympics in 1976. And this goes back to that thing I was talking about, what patrician crap it was in the 70s.
Yeah.
After the opening ceremony, the British Olympic Association pulls all the athletes in and sits them down and starts having a go at them and says, that's the worst marching performance we've ever seen in an opening ceremony. And fair play to him, Ovett says, yeah, well, we're not soldiers, we're athletes, we're here to compete, and has none of it. And actually, famously, Ovett had none of it quite often through his career. He just wouldn't put up with it, and you just think, good for you, fella.
The worst marching performance. It shows you how much things have changed, and we were still almost in that post-war hinterland, really, weren't we?
That generation who'd fought the war, were firmly in charge of things. You think about it, it's 25, 30 years after the war. They're the generation that, sadly our age now, 50, 60, in charge of things. Butcher's very clear that there were a lot of public schoolboy amateurs running things and not doing a very good job.
Still happening.
Yeah, exactly. He's fair. He says a lot of the public schoolboys who went into coaching and a sort of middle level of sport actually did a really good job, and they were really driven and they did a great job. A lot of the people who ran it were kind of NIMBYs, or I've got my blazer and the seat on the plane to the Olympics. I don't really care about the athlete. That's that classic thing where, committees used to travel first class and the teams used to travel in third, that kind of thing.
It makes me think of John Gielgud's character in Coming Back to Chariots of Fighting. We believe that the way of the amateur, and they were incredibly amateur, and that is now seen quite rightly as a pejorative term. But why has Coe and Ovett never been made into a movie, or has it?
There might have been a documentary, and I've heard talk of a movie a few times.
Yeah.
I'm sure Coe wouldn't mind because he's a public figure, but Ovett basically isn't really a public figure. After their careers, he did a bit of commentary and stuff. But his Wikipedia entry, because I looked it up, is about 8 paragraphs long.
Right.
I didn't look at Coe's, but I'd imagine it's a bit longer. So Ovett goes to the 76 Olympics. Doesn't do great, but it's kind of like a year too early for him.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting guy called Ivo van Dam who runs in those, and he wins silver in 800 and 1500, and we'll come back to him later. But yeah, Ivo van Dam's an interesting character. So there's this narrative that we've talked about. Ovett was portrayed in a not very flattering light by the press. And most of that's because he didn't get on with the press and actually started to blank them. And that happened because he's being selected internationally. He's running Montreal, not done great, but, competed, got his first Olympics, all that sort of stuff. And he gets selected to run for England in an international and says, I don't think I'm going to go. I've got other things arranged. And the Daily Mail's athletics correspondent gets very offended and says, it's unpatriotic, how dare you? And Ovett just goes, yeah, whatever, and sort of moves on.
Mm.
And then as a result of that, Ovett just gets endless crap from the press. And I mean, I've been a journalist for a long time.
Mm.
I wouldn't give you tuppence for most of the tabloid press for certainly my entire career while I've been looking at it. I think they're awful.
Mm.
And I think they were even worse in the 70s and 80s. I think they actually treated people appallingly. And when you look at what's emerged in the light of phone tapping and stuff like that, their behaviour's been pretty disgusting. And the way they treated people disgustingly.
Yeah.
And Ovett was on the wrong end of it and just went, perhaps because of where he'd come from and that sort of toughness that he'd had bred into him by his mum, he just went, I'm not having it, and just didn't talk to the press for years. Famously, one of my favourite bits is he's not talking to the press, but occasionally get caught post-race by someone saying, well, you've got a comment for the fans or something like that, and he gets a mic stuck under his nose after winning a race in August one year and says, you've got a comment for the fans, and he turns around and goes, Happy Christmas. And it's just, that's all he says. So he's got this relationship with the press, whereas when Coe comes up,
right,
I don't think necessarily, and he might have been because he's a smart cookie, he might have been smart about it, but he just had been brought up in that sort of middle class way of sort of, someone's asked me a question, I'll ask. Just a bit more worldly wise, and fitting a bit more into what the press wanted. That give them what they want and they'll treat me well. And that's pretty much what happened. Ovett got treated appallingly by the press, and Coe didn't. Although I will say there's a bit in the book where Coe gets to university and turns out to be a bit of a cad, which I didn't know.
Oh,
Talking about amateurism and that.
Yeah.
And how people are treated. That's all coming to the end in the 70s.
Yeah.
People are getting paid basically little envelopes of cash and stuff like that, and it essentially comes to an end. They set up trust funds for athletes, so they become basically the two leading 800 and 1500 meter runners in the world. Ovett goes 3 years building into the 1980 Olympics undefeated at 1500 meters and a mile. And for people who don't know, the mile is kind of the magic distance, but it's not the Olympic distance. The 1500 meters, the metric mile, gets run in the Olympics. A mile is actually 109 meters longer, and it's the classic, imperial measurement. Some of the African and French runners refer to it as the British distance.
Oh, okay.
Because they ran metric distances.
Of course.
And some great African athletes don't mile particularly well because it's not something they run very much.
Yeah.
But anyway, Ovett goes undefeated, and actually it's seen as going into the 1980 Olympics, Coe is red-hot favourite for the 800 metres, and Ovett is red-hot favourite for the 1500. They're both running in both events. They get to the Olympics, and this is actually where the book is brilliant. Some of the writing in the sort of first half of the book, it's good and it's interesting, but it's, how can I put it? It's like I say, it's just, it tells the story and it's fine. But because Pat Butcher's an athletics correspondent, he talks to all the people who are competing in those races, the 800 and the 1500 in Moscow. And there's a couple of things about Moscow you need to know. One, not everyone went. There was a ban. The Americans banned their athletes from going, and the British government didn't want our athletes to go.
Was it because of Afghanistan?
It was because of Afghanistan, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. To me, I think the athletes were completely right to go, because the idea of a ban was complete, let's say rubbish. It was complete rubbish.
Yeah.
Because the government, Mrs. Thatcher's government, want to support Reagan's government and are writing to the athletes saying, don't go, we think it's an abrogation, it's unpatriotic, what the Russians are doing is terrible. And they're actually... There was one athlete, I don't think it was Coe or Ovett, who got sent 6 letters, and one of them included a picture of a dead Afghan child near a soft toy.
Oh.
And it's like, yes, what the Russians were doing was absolutely appalling, as with what the Americans did 20 years later,
of course,
30 years later. But while the government are telling the athletes not to go, BP are signing pipeline deals. All other things are going ahead, but they're trying to, because Moscow is a high-profile example, they're trying to make the athletes undermine it.
Taking a phony moral high ground, in other words.
Absolutely. And, given his politics, you could see a case for Coe sort of supporting that, and he just went, no, it was rubbish. BP was signing a pipeline deal. I'm not having it. And Ovett, I don't think Ovett was particularly interested in the politics of it, although in the build-up, while they're getting all this stuff about not going, Ovett, he'd swapped a shirt with a Soviet athlete at some meet, and right in the build-up, he ran in this Soviet vest and said, oh, no, it's really comfortable. So anyway, that's the context of the Moscow Olympics. Then the two of them get there, and the book is brilliant. The book is absolutely brilliant, especially on the 800 metres, because, like I say, he's talking to the athletes who ran with them. He talks to Coe and Ovett, and it puts you right there in so there's a holding room where they hold athletes before they go out onto the track. So, I don't know, the women's 5,000 metres is being run and they're waiting to run the 800 metre final. So they're held in a room, and he puts you right there in that room, and he talks to the other runners that were competing, and he says, Coe's red-hot favourite, but he looks really nervous. He interviews Coe, and Coe talks about just waking up that morning and feeling uncoordinated and not with it. And it's obviously his nerves that have got to him. He's in the canteen and he drops a big pot of milk because he's just so uncoordinated. Whereas Ovett walks in, and for him, Coe's the favourite, so the pressure's off Ovett. He makes a point of walking in really late to this waiting room. So they're told to go into the waiting room, and everyone else is in there for 45 minutes. But Ovett doesn't go in until they say, mate, if you don't go in that room now, you're going to be disqualified. So he goes in 15 minutes later than everyone else into this narrow, horrible concrete room, and he goes in shaking everyone's hand and good luck, no matter what he says, no matter what happens, the sun will come up tomorrow. And Coe's there not being sick, but effectively, metaphorically. And Ovett's like, yeah, fine. And then they get into the race and they talk about the tactics, and it's Butcher puts you right there.
Yeah.
And he talks about, and Coe himself says, he ran a terrible race. He got pushed out to lane 3, which means he's running further.
Right.
And in an 800 metre race, having to run 850 metres is going to take more gas.
Yeah.
And he just says also, Coe and Ovett both think that there was kind of like a conspiracy of the East German athletes or the Eastern Bloc athletes to sort of block them out. Coe's been pushed wide and Ovett has been blocked in by these 2 Eastern European runners. And they reckon that if he ran it the way he did today, he'd get disqualified because basically he smashed his way between the two of them. And actually, people underestimate, 400 metres, all the sprints, everything lower than 800 metres is run in lanes.
Yeah.
So they're protected. But when you get up to 800 and 1500, and I'm talking like I could do it, I once walked 1500 meters, it's actually quite physical, and you sometimes see people fall, and there's plenty of elbows and stuff like that. And it, you know, Ovett was an overtly physical runner in a way that Coe wasn't, certainly at the time, and he smashed his way through, and he wins, Coe's event. And you know, Coe, the thing is, everything Ovett's been aiming for is an Olympic gold medal.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing is that they both have this weird experience after the 800 meters, and like Ovett was hated by the press because he didn't talk to them, and he woke up to headlines saying "bad guy wins."
Whoa!
And you know, and Coe had headlines like he went out for a run the next day just to shake it out of his system, and there's a picture the day after that saying Coe's trail of shame, and you just sort of think, if you want to know about the tabloid press, that's who they were. That's how they were behaving. That's what they were saying. But Ovett, as he crosses the line, this is his moment. He's won an Olympic gold medal. And instantly he goes, isn't there more? It's like almost like an empty experience. And he likens it to getting out of jail. It's not joy, it's relief.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because they've built this pressure. And, I've read plenty about athletes and stuff, and they quite often talk about that. Is this it? Is this everything I've aimed for? But it's really funny. The two of my favourite things about this race, and I thought they would be in the book, but it turned out I'd read them somewhere else in an article by Sean Ingle in The Guardian, and I'll put a link out to that, is that the next day, Daley Thompson comes into Coe's room, and Coe's in bed, just get away. Daley Thompson, and you've got to remember, Daley Thompson, of all the athletes of the early 80s, was my favourite because he was just the coolest man on earth. But anyway, opens the curtains and Coe says, "What's the weather like?" And Thompson turns around and goes, "Oh, clouds are a bit silvery." And it's just like rubbing in that he hasn't won the gold, he's won the silver.
Right.
Coe talks in this article about actually the COD psychology of Daley Thompson was actually quite good for him.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's what you need from your mates, isn't it?
Yeah.
You don't need them to be sympathetic and all, but that's
No,
really
it's
sad.
the beginnings of prompting you to move on, isn't it?
Exactly.
No matter what your trauma. Yeah.
And then actually, the funny thing is, in this Sean Ingle article, there's this other story, which again, it isn't in the book.
Yeah.
But so Coe and Ovett, years and years later, are sat at a dinner.
Yeah.
And they didn't talk that often. You get the idea that they were perfectly fine with each other, but they were never close. And Coe says one Christmas in the late 70s, when they're clearly rivals, Christmas Day, he goes for his run, sits down, has his Christmas dinner, and he's sat watching the Dam Busters or The Great Escape or whatever. And this is before the time of socials and stuff like that, so he had no idea what Ovett was doing. And he sits there, he's watching the Dam Busters, and he sort of says, "I bet he's gone out and doing a second run today. It's Christmas Day. I bet he's gone out and doing a second run." And he tells Ovett this at this dinner when they're both 50 or whatever. And this is why I love Ovett. He apparently leant into Coe and went, "So you only ran twice that day?" and it's just like, it's perfect, you know? And I love stuff like that, those little lines.
I do remember the stories, though, of, I didn't realise it was specifically Christmas Day, but about them sitting there, or at least Coe sitting there, paranoidly wondering what Ovett was done while he was watching Top of the Pops.
That was their rivalry.
Full of Christmas pudding.
So after the 800 metres, Ovett's got his Olympic gold. There's all this rubbish in the papers, and he's getting even more of it than Coe, although Coe's not doing great. And then Steve Cram had just started to come in, and he went to the 1980 Olympics. Not, he was the third British man and wasn't expected to do much, but he was in that warm-up room again before the 1500 metres, and he said it was really weird how Ovett came in and was clearly nervous. This man hadn't lost at 1500 metres for 3 years, whereas Coe was just off in a corner, dead-eyed, and they suddenly got the idea, Cram certainly, that he might not be unbeatable. Coe goes out, and runs the perfect race. And I think people should Google it, because there's the brilliant picture of Coe crossing the line, looking almost like he's in pain, but it's this mix of pain and relief, and he's got his arms wide and he's giving it that, and he's like, and it's a really strange picture, but it's brilliant. Anyway, that's the heart of the book, is actually the 1980 Olympics, and it goes on to talk about their rivalry, how they, at one point, I think it was in 1981, Coe broke the mile record. 3 or 4 days later, Ovett broke it, and then in the space of 9 days, Coe got it back. That's how good they were. They were just absolutely slaughtering it. But it's like, and actually, the other thing I wanted to mention, Ivo van Dam, this guy had done brilliantly in 1976.
Yeah.
He actually died in an accident before the 1980 Olympics. And both Coe and Ovett and a lot of other people around athletics say, we all talk about Coe and Ovett, but Ivo van Dam won 2 silvers as a young athlete in 76.
Yeah.
If he'd survived, we might never talk about Coe and Ovett. After that, 81, they were starting to get paid for running. They broke world records. Ovett picked up a massive injury. He ran into a railing.
Sounds like my sports career.
I think the trick is, mate, he started with a lot of talent. But yeah, and then he never quite got to that level again, certainly at an Olympics. And, he was ill during the Olympics in 84, whereas Coe retained his 1500 metre title and wasn't necessarily in the frame to do that for quite a long time. There was controversy around his selection in 83 for the World Championship.
Okay.
It's a really funny book because there are, to quote the title of the show, there are brilliant bits. The story is so good. The rivalry is so intense. They were the top boys that actually you'd struggle to write a bad book about it. And to be fair, Butcher's done loads of work. And honestly, the bits in the warm-up room and taking you into it, and some of the stuff that Coe and Ovett tell him, and he does really well to interview Ovett, because Ovett's just not one of life's talkers. So yeah, it's absolutely worth a read. I think it's very good, but the heart of it is the Moscow Games and that sort of the 800 and the 1500, and just how intense that experience was. So come on then, what have you got?
Right. I've got this book by Ian Wade, 1984, the year pop went queer. Now, the way I discovered this book was that I was re-listening to Depeche Mode's album from last year, which I don't know how into Depeche you are, Si, but they did this album called...
I know the hits. As I've said before, mate, I'm a greatest hits guy.
Greatest hits, well, that's fine. But they did an album last year called Memento Mori, which I thought was great. And I think a lot of people got great reviews. And when I was re-listening to it recently, I went on to Quietus and I read this very intelligent piece about it by Ian Wade. And I thought, wow, this is brilliant. I even messaged the guy. I don't know him personally. Seems we know a few people in common in the tiny world of music writing. And I just said, this is absolutely great. And then so I Googled him and I came across this book and I thought, got to have a bit of this book. So yeah, 1984, the year pop went queer, and it makes a very good case for that moment that was sort of 17 or 18 years, almost, but not quite because of the political atmosphere at the time, almost the age of consent between when the illegality of homosexuality was abolished to people who'd grown up with homosexuality no longer being illegal, basically. But it comes up with some really, really interesting bits. And, calling this podcast, this bit's brilliant. Almost every bit of this is brilliant. But I'll try and keep my enthusiasm reined in a little bit. But it talks about Frankie Goes to Hollywood's debut performance on Top of the Pops in January 1984. And what's interesting about this, it talks about the post-Christmas gruel of that particular Top of the Pops. And I'll remind you of a couple of them. Although one drew a complete blank, Si, which was the Rod Stewart hit, in inverted commas, of the era, called Sweet Surrender, which I certainly don't know. And I Googled it and it was completely unmemorable. But it says here, among the turns that evening are some legends who've been knocking around since the show began. There's Rod Stewart leering with his top 32 smash hit, Sweet Surrender, which, one would wager, even the man himself can't recall. Excellent stinging put down. And I don't have any problem with Rod as a person. He hasn't made any decent music after about 1975, apart from the odd single. But he's such a character. And I remember a while ago, he said he has gone back into songwriting, but for a long time he was just doing covers in the American Songbook. And one interviewee said to him, "Why aren't you writing songs, Rod?" And he said, "What am I supposed to write about? That the gardener charged too much?" And I thought that is typical of the genius of the man. So you don't have to like his current output to think that he's really funny. But it also talks about the other things that were on Top of the Pops that day, such as George Cole and Dennis Waterman singing "What Are We Gonna Get for Her Indoors?" Which was
I think I remember that.
Yeah, it was. I remember it was terrible. They were on Top of the Pops, and George Cole didn't know where he was quite clearly. And Roland Rat was also on, and the rest of those festive novelties.
I definitely remember Roland Rat. Oh my God,
And
proper novelty record territory.
Oh God, terrible. He was a sort of puppet version of Blakey from On the Buses. There's a reference to the teenagers for you.
Mate, you're really helping the younger viewer and listener there.
Well,
that thing you don't remember from 1984. Here's a reference that takes it back to 1973. Thanks. Go on.
It talks about the way they were looking and what they're calling the iconography of the Leatherman. You've got like Paul Rutherford, the backup dancer, all in this gear. And this is another brilliant quote here. The iconography of the Leatherman, a symbol of strength and idealized manliness, the clone, played a significant part in the relaxed video, emphasizing a shorthand of fetish, as well as giving the promo and Frankie themselves a certain toughness. The leather subculture was a way of signifying that the participants distinguished themselves away from traditional notions of homosexuality. In other words, not John Inman from Are You Being Served?
Okay, so look, just quickly,
yeah,
because you kind of just went straight on to talking about the Leatherman.
Yeah.
Paul Rutherford, was he that other singer in Frankie?
Yeah, he was the guy in the background with a mustache bopping around going, goes to war, like this, just doing the odd line.
Dressed as a Leatherman means he was like leather cap,
yeah,
jacket, all that. I can't remember the art. There's an artist, Tom of Finland. That's it, Tom of Finland, who sort of drew this subculture, and then he sort of drew the subculture, and then the subculture followed his paintings as well, didn't it?
It's sort of influencing each other. He was portraying the culture, but he then directly influenced the culture. Without Tom of Finland drawing these pictures, there's, Freddie Mercury's probably still dressed up in a blouse rather than the sort of direction that he went in, perhaps. But also, or
a unitard, one of the great clothing items. Good work, Freddie. Well played.
I love those, I must say. I wouldn't wear them myself, but never mind.
Mate, I've got three in the cupboard.
You can give us a little parade off camera. It also had best thumbnail sketch here of Trevor Horn's career that he should have put on the jacket of his autobiography. So this bit's brilliant as well. At this point, Trevor Horn, he was, of course, was the producer of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Trevor Horn was having what could be termed a very successful 80s. Not only had he enjoyed having, as one half of the Buggles, the first song played on MTV with Video Killed a Radio Star, he'd also dragged Progger's Yes into the 20th century and rescued hapless end-of-pier-turn Dollar from the dumper by turning them into a futurist pop force. That is alchemy. He is the Rumpelstiltskin of pop production, turning straw into gold. So that's good. But it moves on as well, just drawing all of these things together. Bronski Beat are the big one for me in this, but I did want to touch on your favourites here, Queen, because it talks about how they'd taken a sort of turn into the sort of gay disco market, which with their unloved 1982 album, Hot Space, which has
actually got a couple of bangers on it, hasn't it?
Got a couple of bangers. You've got Las Palabras de Amor. You've got Back Chat, which I think is an absolute banger. Is Under Pressure on there? Did they put Under Pressure is on there?
I thought Another One Bites the Dust was on there.
No, that is on The Game in 1980, nerdy fans. But it's beginning to point in that direction. It sort of presages that career. even though that
it was a lot of it was the bass player John Deacon wanted to go that way, didn't he?
Indeed, and that's the interesting thing. So it's not just, as some people stereotype the idea of Freddie Mercury dragging them into this sort of gay disco sound. That was John Deacon a couple of years before. But it talks about Hot Space, and it makes a brilliant reference to the, how can we say, riotously heterosexual Roger Taylor, the drummer in Queen, where it says, Hot Space has its knockers, although maybe not quite as many knockers as Roger Taylor would have liked. I thought that was a nice way of setting out Mr. Taylor's credentials. But it says that Michael Jackson says that Hot Space was a massive influence on Thriller. And a nice little dig here from Ian Wade. Yes, indeed, he quotes it. But he says, Hot Space had been an influence on Thriller, which went on to sell considerably more copies, 66 million more. But the thing that it talks about specifically to do with Queen in 1984, they did an album which I'm sure you'll be very aware of called The Works, where they decided, right, we're going to come back and we're going to reinforce the Queen brand. But they'd already done that little sort of nod to sort of the gay market, and that what we would now quite rightly see as a sort of inclusive thing. And they did a video for. In fact, I think The Works was called The Works because Roger Taylor said, "Let's give them the works," and they were just going to go full throttle. They did a video, which I'm sure you remember, for "I Want to Break Free," which in our country and in most of Europe, etc., was seen as a bit of fun, a bit of camp humor, and you had all four members dressed up as sort of in drag, as sort of like they're in Coronation Street, that sort of thing. Now, I thought it was hilarious. Grannies of the time thought it was hilarious. All over the world, everyone got it, except in North America, where MTV banned that video, and that association meant that Queen went down the dumper and effectively blew the American market for the rest of their career. So that nod to something that was not seen as meat and potatoes, redneck rock, actually cost them financially, obviously, but in terms of profile in the States. So what they did was brave, and Roger Taylor, even though he later admitted he didn't really like Hot Space, he was very supportive at the time and said, we can't just repeat ourselves. We've got to try other things, otherwise we're dead. So even though they then, corrected course, they took a significant bit of that musical DNA with them going forward on things like Radio Gaga. But the biggest thing for me here, I think, in this chapter, there's so much good stuff in this, but I'll come to the sort of, the main thing is talks about Bronski Beat and the immortal Small Town Boy, which is finally addressing a subject that was taboo until then. What the Daily Mail might have called in the 1970s the plight of the regional homosexual, where you've got young gay men escaping from abuse, possibly at home and certainly in their hometown environment, and moving to London. And it's an incredible piece of work still. If anyone watching this podcast has not heard that song, it's definitely worth going and have a listen to. And Jimmy Somerville has been very supportive of a cover that's just come out by The Knocks, featuring Perfume Genius on lead vocals, which is very respectful of the original version. It has a bit more of a modern sort of beat to it. I mean, if you look it up on Spotify or if you look it up on Apple Music, it says Bronski Beat and The Knocks featuring Perfume Genius. I can't hear Bronski Beat on there, but I think it's officially saying we love this, we support this. It's the 40th anniversary of that. There's a 40th anniversary of Bronski Beat's album The Age of Consent coming out very soon. So it's very much in the culture. But what it talks about in here, there are so many excellent bits. It talks about when a Small Town Boy was released, it was taken down to the nightclub Heaven and ended up getting played 3 times that night because it just blew everybody's minds. And also in the Inner Groove, do you remember Inner Groove, Si? Where you'd get little messages written on the Inner Groove?
The bit where the music ran out, but there was something on there, was there?
There certainly was. And on the Inner Groove of the 12-inch version of their Small Town Boy, they put the phone number of the London Gay Switchboard, which was an amazing thing to do at the time. And quite recently, Jimmy Somerville was reflecting on this, and Ian has collected this in here, saying it was an amazing time because gay men and lesbians had just found their voice, and you could introduce the idea that being gay wasn't just what the tabloids would call the twilight world of the homosexual. It's ridiculous to think this now, he says, but that hadn't been addressed, this topic, in pop music before. These were fairly intimidating times where you'd get abuse from the police and the public on a pride march, and now, of course, they're seen as a family day out. You know, you'll find it in every guy going, which is brilliant. And one other thing it talks about is the support of lesbians and gays for the miners' strike, which of course was happening at the time as well. They called it the pits and the perverts benefit, as a sort of little dig at the way they were being perceived in the press. And one of the delegates of the National Union of Mine Workers said to the audience at the event, "You have worn our badge, coal not dole, and you know what harassment means, as we do. Now we will pin your badge on us. We will support you. It won't change overnight, but now 140,000 miners know that there are other causes and other problems. We know about black people and gays and nuclear disarmament. There are other issues, and things will never be the same." And I think that's quite prescient, because I think that is the beginning, finally, of, you know, before that, gay people were sort of, well, they weren't even tolerated, but it was no longer illegal. Now things have quite rightly switched completely. And I just think the bravery of people like Steve Bronski and Jimmy Somerville in doing that should be acknowledged. I'd like to just mention a couple of other things in here, which I thought were absolutely fantastic quotes. He does a whole chapter on high energy music, and talking about, you know, you sort of completely derided. He says, he begins his chapter on high energy music, which immediately makes me think of the high energy, the hit that sounded a little bit like Relaxed by Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Paul, you're singing again.
I know, but at least I didn't try and do Jimmy Somerville. That would have been a little bit off.
No, let's stay away from that.
We'll move on. But he begins the chapter saying, high energy, a music that's seldom celebrated, trashy, tinny, shallow, clattering. It's a sound of music at its most basic, a true metal machine music. Nice little Lou Reed reference there. It adheres to the structure of rock and features the dynamics of rock, and yet is culturally absent, blank. It's nadir as far as critical wisdom is concerned. It's occasionally a shorthand for homophobic approaches to what gay people like. It's surface, baseless, and bereft of depth. It's also full of yearning and wonder. And Ian Wade, if you're watching this podcast, that is a brilliant bit of writing. And this book is stuffed with brilliant bits of writing. This bit's brilliant. This whole book's brilliant.
You almost said that like an ex-radio guy.
Strange that, isn't it? But this has got to be, you know, what a podcast like this is about, that you're reaching a book that is so inspiring, and we just want to tell other people about it.
I think that's the truth. I think it's like, I mean, that sounds like a brilliant book about a really interesting story, whereas I think The Perfect Distance is it's a good book about an absolutely amazing story.
Yeah.
I think that's us, isn't it?
I think it is.